first time since Ukraine's incursion into Russia. Journalists from The Times and The Sun have joined Ukrainian soldiers on the front line inside Russia. The Times' Catherine Philp and The Sun's Jerome Starkey have been in the Kursk region, where Ukrainians now control hundreds of square miles of Russian territory. We can speak now to Jerome Starkey, The Sun's defence editor. Morning, Jerome.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us. First of all, just explain to us where you've been, what you've seen.
Thanks. Yeah, well, we visited a town called Sudzha, which is the largest town inside Russia that's now under Ukrainian control. It used to be home to about 5,000 people, and by road it's just about 7 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So in one sense, not very far, but of course in another sense it's a completely different world, and it's been cut off for 2.5 years. That border, which used to be relatively open, has been sealed tightly shut, and the two sides have been trading missiles and artillery. As we know, Ukraine's been under ferocious bombardment. We joined Ukraine's armed forces. They took us up there. They insisted we travel in an armored vehicle because of the risk of Russian drones, artillery and rockets on both sides of the border, but particularly inside this occupied patch of Russian land. Ukraine now claims to have about 1,300 square kilometers. That's an area roughly the same size as the Brecon Beacons National Park, and inside it are about 100 settlements, and they range from towns like Sudzha to villages and tiny hamlets. And we spent most of our time, as I said, in Sudzha, meeting just a handful of Russians. I mean, most of the population have fled. The soldiers said there were perhaps 600 people left in the town that was home to 5,000 before, and in the time that we had on the ground, which is really just a few hours, we saw perhaps a dozen or so and spoke to as many as we could.
And before you tell us what they said, were they handpicked? Could you speak to anybody? Were there any restrictions on your movements?
There were restrictions on our movements. We could only go where the Ukrainian soldiers took us. Absolutely. We were sort of on a trip which they had facilitated. That's the only way to get into this territory at the moment. Whether or not these people were handpicked, in one sense, no. I mean, there was one lady we met she was walking across the town's main square when we happened to be there, and she'd been collecting food from Ukrainian forces, and she said, she had no choice but to do that because all the shops in the town are closed and most people have fled, and there's no real way for supplies to come in. Because obviously the area between what Ukraine holds and what Russia holds is now an active front line. There's fighting, and Ukraine isn't, allowing civilians to pass freely back into Ukraine. We also went to a shelter where, particularly, it seemed to be invalids, the old and the frail, were being supported by Ukrainian soldiers. There were like dormitory rooms where we met a couple of ladies in their 70s. One of them was just 17 years old, and those were the people who couldn't escape, couldn't get away. Now, were they handpicked? No, they were sort of a self-selecting group because they had gone to this shelter that the Ukrainians were running. There were Ukrainian soldiers around us all the time, men with guns, and I'm sure that would influence perhaps what those people were willing to tell us. But they certainly weren't professing love for the Ukrainians, nor were they professing love for Russia or condemning either side. I think the people we spoke to were deliberately perhaps rather vague and neutral in the opinions that they expressed. But for me, the most interesting sentiment that did come through, and I had the impression that this really was genuine, was that these people who've been living just a few miles north of Ukraine for years were not really giving the war next door a second thought. And that was what's so astonishing. Whilst this war has been raging in Ukraine, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, destroying countless billions of pounds worth of property, the people on the other side of the Russian border were more or less indifferent, just getting on with their ordinary lives. And of course, that is human nature. We do that as well a lot of the time, when we're not focused on these conflicts. But yet it was so close, and suddenly now the war has come crashing home to them as the land they live in has become an active front line and is now controlled by Ukrainian forces.
And in light of that they hadn't given the war much thought, but clearly now it has reached them, has it changed their attitude towards Putin, towards Russia, towards the war, towards Ukraine?
There was one person we spoke to who expressed a negative view of President Putin in a sort of fairly muted language, but he talked about how a fish rots from the head. And in another breath, he talked about how he had friends in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, one of the Ukraine's second largest city, which is a bit to the southeast of Suja. And that really was emblematic of the very close ties that lots of people in both countries have. And most people that I've met in Ukraine have family or friends, or had family or friends in Russia, and particularly in these border regions. And that was true of the people we met in Russia. I mean, one of the women was actually Ukrainian. She'd lived in Donbass, in Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine, but had fled there 5 years ago because of the fighting that started in 2014. So, the irony for her was she had moved away from eastern Ukraine to escape the fighting. And she went to a place that she thought was so small and out of the way, a quiet little backwater that would never be caught up in the conflict. And now it has come home to her. And interestingly, one of the messages that President Zelensky has delivered since this lightning assault started on August 6th was that he said it's important for Russians to feel the effects of the war that Vladimir Putin started. And certainly the impression we had from that visit to Kursk was that for many, many people, for many, many years, they've been immune to or inured to the effects of this conflict. And so at least for those people, and this is a tragedy, those people in Suja, the war has come home. For those people who've had to flee their homes and those people who can no longer live in their homes and are forced to live in shelters, it has come home. But whilst it's a significant patch of land, whilst this land may yet prove to be a bargaining chip or a buffer zone for Ukraine, it is still a relatively tiny piece of Russia. And therefore, we can only assume that perhaps most Russians in the rest of sovereign Russian territory continue to be indifferent or unaware of what's going on.
Jerome, really fascinating insight. Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you.
That is The Sun's Jerome Starkey. He is their defence editor. He and the Times' Catherine Philp have been inside the Kursk region, inside Russia, with Ukrainian troops, speaking to Russians. As he said, there are many not even really aware of what was going on in the war, just 7 miles over the border.